Welcome to our extended discussion on the future of learning disabilities. This discussion began as a town hall meeting at the Council for Exceptional Children's 2010 Convention and Expo in Nashville. This 20-minute podcast condenses presentations by Lou Danielson of the American Institutes for Research, Margaret McLaughlin of the University of Maryland, Mary Brownell of the University of Florida, and Doug Fuchs of Vanderbilt University. The town hall format was new to the CEC convention in 2010. These events gave experts in the field the opportunity to offer multiple perspectives on a particular topic. Meanwhile, it gave the audience the chance to respond to points made by the presenters, to pose questions that extended the perspectives, and hear answers from the experts and each other. This condensed discussion offers you the chance to respond to these presenters as well. CEC will use your comments to inform the 2011 Town Hall, addressing learning disabilities with another year's research and practice to consider. The podcast opens with Dr. Danielson, and then proceeds to Dr. McLaughlin, Dr. Brownell, and Dr. Fuchs. Enjoy.
Let me launch into the piece that kind of my reflections. One is the evolution in the meaning of access. In 1975, with 94-142 passing, actually probably access wasn't even used as a term then, but as I think about access then, it was really right to education. I mean, it was that we established nationally that kids with disabilities had a right to an education, and so basically access then was access to education. There were in that important law something that's come to be called LRE provisions, and as that statute began to be implemented, we began to talk then about social access. 1997, with reauthorization, then for the first time, the words access to general ed curriculum kind of popped into the legislation. Access to content. And that was accelerated really with NCLB, because in NCLB, it was really then access to the same content standards and then accountability for results. Evolution and conceptualization of learning disabilities. At the beginning, we talked about deficits and basic psychological processes. But when LD regs were written in the late 1970s, even though that was in the definition, what came out of federal law really had nothing to do with psychological processes. It was really about a discrepancy between academic ability and achievement. And then more recently, this has evolved into basically the conceptualization is failure to respond, or maybe even dual discrepancy. That's failure to respond combined with low achievement. Evolution in the general ed special ed relationship. For years and years, people have talked about these separate silos, and NCLB was important, of course, because for the first time you had a piece of non-special ed legislation that really had important provisions related to the education of kids with disabilities. There now is a blueprint for reauthorized ESEA, and what's notable in my view in that blueprint is the absence of discussion about the education of kids with disabilities.
I want to say that we all in this room, without any
Is that you?
That's me, thank you. Without any disagreement, would say that there are children and adults who are out there who have had and will continue to have very different characteristics in the way in which they learn, the pace at which they learn, and how they function generally in society. And that these differences go beyond the demographic characteristics of these individuals and or their families. And we acknowledge that. Secondly, I think there is no disagreement. So this is very much like health care. We know that there are people among us who don't have health care. We want them to have health care. For these individuals who have these characteristics, we do want and believe that the education that is provided to them should help them reach maximum educational attainment. With policy, unlike in some other areas, trying to look at the future of policy, which was my task, by looking at the past, assumes that conditions remain constant. And this is like driving a car by looking in the rearview mirror. So the way we have to think about policy for students with the characteristics that I've described, learning disabilities, other disabilities, we must be always aware of the context in which it's occurring. Lou gave us a very good overview, very quick overview of the past. And past policy, we know within that policy that the construct of learning disabilities has always been ambiguous, and the metrics that have been used to define it have been highly contested. And by that I mean whether we've got RTI or discrepancy models or whatever. We also know that the characteristics of children who we have typified as having learning disabilities and the needs of those children have required soft boundaries between general and special education. However, the entitlement to FAPE has established some very formal and rather inflexible at times borders between general and special education. We have now reached another era, if you will, in pre-K through actually 20, if you look at that blueprint, education. And the way in which the education of children with learning disabilities is operating in present policy is within a context that assumes, unlike where it was in the 75 legislation, that any child who requires something different, something more economically, should have it. But the intent is for those children to have it in order to reach the same outcomes. It was only in the 70s and 80s that general education began to move toward the idea that we no longer should focus on the front end, but on those outcomes. We are still at a very uneasy, I would say, fit between that concept of appropriate being defined solely as individual goals and individualized outcomes as to one that supports or endorses individualized strategies, unequal or more resources, but based on the same outcomes. So the concept, as Lou said, about RTI is challenging the construct of learning disabilities. But I think equally, if not more importantly, is that FAPE is being redefined as we move into and have been moving into and evolving into a different policy context in the pre-K through 12 environment. I think in present policy, and I think this is both a risk as well as a benefit, I think there are definitely trade-offs. Learning disabilities is increasingly being seen not as an exotic or different, qualitatively different entity, if you will, but as one of several risk factors that contribute to an individual student's attainment level. And the way it's being looked at is the contribution of learning disabilities along with the most powerful driver, really, which is the student's SES, and the amount of variance that it contributes to these educational attainments, whether it's high school graduation, post-secondary success, or even at the level of individual assessments. We also are in an environment where we have, through the research base in special education in general, and specifically for students who have been identified as having learning disabilities, interventions that have been proven and are continuing to be proven to be effective for students who have multiple risk factors, LD being one, but low SES and other known demographic risk factors. So, what does this say about our future policy and practice? These boundaries between special and general education are only going to continue to soften. I think the IDEA and the other pre-K through 20 policies, as expressed through the Elementary Secondary Education Act, the Higher Education Act, and various state initiatives, are beginning to show a greater meshing, if you will, of some key policy areas. First, we're seeing the sharing of common goals in these policies of increasing this educational attainment. Two, I think we're sharing a number of policy strategies of focus on increasing resources, and this is primarily in the general ed, based on student data and student need, and where the greatest needs are, I should say. And as Lou alluded to, accountability and similar, the assessment policies that have come through IDEA, we're also sharing the policy tools. which are common standards, common assessments, and accountability for individual and group performance. From a policy perspective, I think we first and foremost need to re-examine the construct of disability, not just learning disabilities, but the overall construct of disability, and what is its meaning within education. Along with that, we need to re-examine the interpretation of FAPE, and I've referenced that before. We need to be very aware that appropriate, or we need to define what appropriate means. I shouldn't say aware, but we certainly know that appropriate is morphing into something that is quasi-standards-based. And that then leads to the next big thing we need to do, and that is to determine the added value, or value added if you want, that special education brings to good general education. If that's what special education means, it means that it's something that happens in a smaller group or in a different place or provides more intensive instruction. That's fine. Let's acknowledge that that's what it does. But then let's recognize what are those teachers doing in those other environments. And how does that differ from what we expect the general education teacher to do?
I want to make a couple points in this presentation. One, that quality teachers will be fundamental to the implementation of RTI. In fact, it could be one of the most important foundations for it outside of evidence-based practice. And both general education and special education will be an important part of that, because if Tier 1 and Tier 2, which general education will probably be providing, is not sufficient, then it's going to be hard to provide Tier 3 instruction or figure out those students that need to move to Tier 3 instruction. And I'm going to do that by talking about what quality teaching is. Here's some of our definitions and assumptions that I'm going to unpack for just a brief moment. Under NCLB and IDEA, we conceive of expert teachers or highly qualified teachers as those who have extensive content knowledge, and in special education, they have both content knowledge and knowledge of special education, because that's how this is defined right now under the law. In special education, I think historically we've thought of special education teachers, at least, as teachers who have knowledge of evidence-based practice and assessment. Think about this as only this big pie as only 20% of the variance, because teachers, between classroom variance that contributes to student achievement, is only about 20%. Maggie alluded to the fact that students make up the largest portion of the variance in their own performance. They do. It's about 60 to 70%. And schools make up the smallest portion of variance. But teachers are considered one of the largest effects in the educational system outside of students. Goldhaber draws this pie. Imagine this is the between classroom variance. And this is what we get out of the 20%. Only 3% of that, 20%, is you can measure it through content knowledge tests. The idea that teachers have all this discipline knowledge and it matters is questionable. So what is some of the recent research telling us about content and practice? Tests of enacted knowledge, for instance, that Deborah Ball and her colleagues have developed, and Jeffrey Phelps in math and reading, are important. And what do I mean by tests of enacted knowledge? Tests of enacted knowledge test the kind of knowledge you use when you're teaching. So you might call it pedagogical content knowledge. So I know about math, but not only do I know about math, I also know how to teach it to students. In addition to tests of enacted knowledge, which in our research predicted classroom practice of special education teachers, observations of classroom performance seem to matter in student achievement, both for at-risk students. I don't know if you're familiar with Carol Connor's work, but in our work and other people who are doing work in math, what good teachers do seems to matter in student performance. value-added studies, this is great news for special education, actually. Most of the value-added studies do not show an effect of preparation, but they do in special education. And Feng and Sass have shown that general ed teachers who have preparation in special education secure better achievement gains in math and reading, and special education teachers secure better achievement gains in reading. So how are we going to develop the teachers that we need, the quality teachers that we need when we have inadequate numbers of appropriately certified general ed teachers? Most general ed teachers do not have to take any type of extensive amount of training in special education. We still have chronic shortages of special education teachers. Even though in some states you can take tests to become a special ed teacher, the percentage of special ed shortages are still hovering around 10 to 11%. They have been since 1975. Special education teachers are inadequately prepared to develop content knowledge for teaching mathematics and reading. They're doing well. Mathematics and writing. They're doing well in reading, but not so much there. And fast tracks to the classroom are being advocated, yet fast tracks to the classroom often lead to higher attrition rates. I think unless we align policy between IDEA, ESEA, and the Higher Education Act, we won't move forward. Everybody in colleges of ed and schools, in both general ed and special ed, has to feel the pressure to serve students with disabilities and high-risk students. How can we have consensus about what we're trying to do and hold people accountable if we don't have measurement systems that promote that?
Okay, I will be brief. This ends in a question, okay? These data are from the National Longitudinal Transition Study. The National Longitudinal Transition Study were really two studies. The first one took place in the 1980s. The second took place in the early 2000s, okay? And in between, we had, for better or worse, good and bad, inclusion. So the two NLTS studies are bookends. The National Longitudinal Transition Study is a randomized national sampling of children and youth with disabilities. It's a very ambitious way to get a snapshot, if you will, of how kids with disabilities and youth are doing with, in schools, academically, socially, and so forth. For children and youth with learning disabilities, the first snapshot suggested that they were largely excluded and doing rather poorly by all counts. The second snapshot in the early 2000s indicated that many more of them were now in the mainstream. This is, I think, high school students with LD were doing better generally. More were in the mainstream. They were getting better grades by their general education teachers, okay, than in the 1980s. That's good. But when it came to looking at their academic performance, how they were doing in reading and math, these are the data. If you look at the 11% figure, that's 11% of the sample was above or at least less than one grade level behind. They were somewhere between one grade level behind or better. That's 11% of the sample. 23% of the sample was between 1 and 3 grade levels behind. 45% of the sample, 3 to almost 5 grade levels behind. And 21% of the sample, 5 or more grade levels behind. You see that, on average, this sample of high school children with LD are at about the somewhere between the 16th and the 25th percentile. At what percentile do we have confidence that a first grade child is reading adequately so that that child will be fine in second grade or sixth grade? The question is, what do we do about it? And this is the question I put to you. There are, to simplify things, there are two camps right now. There is the camp that looks at these data and says, we need to make general education stronger. There is another camp that says, we need to make special education stronger. If you were king or queen of the land, which of the two would you decide on? Which of the two would you place a bet on? If I were king, I would place it on special education. Why? Because the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. Special education has not always risen to the challenge. Despite best intentions and tremendous efforts, we know that there are special ed programs, past and present, that are ineffective, that are inadequate, in some cases even shameful. But there is also in our history evidence of when special educators have been extremely effective, have made important differences in the lives of kids. Compare that nuanced history with the history of general education. When and where did general education step up for children with disabilities in terms of academics? Show me the evidence that general educators have improved the academic performance of the children with the most severe learning difficulties. Accommodating the curriculum, co-teaching in the regular classroom, no doubt helps some kids, maybe many kids, with disabilities, including children and youth with learning disabilities. But they are not intensive enough forms of intervention for the children and youth with severe learning problems. And I am one who believes that general education will not deal with those kids. We have a better chance of reorganizing ourselves so that special educators can step up and make the difference for those kids.
Regarding FAPE and as it being redefined, free and appropriate education, are these things, I'm thinking about life skills, what he's going to need to be successful in his life. But are we just are we going to separate the life skills from academics or no?
The issue of life skills, functional skills versus the common universal standards, the common core, is the issue. That's like a second issue of FAPE. And it's a huge policy conundrum.
When I look at RTI, what I like is kind of the cycling idea that you're going to, for the kids who do have to go up to level 3, which is great that they get those services, but we want to bring them back out of there too. And unless we can get our general educators to take those instructional models that have worked for them at level 3 and implement them in some way, maybe a thin schedule or whatever, in tier 2 and 1, I don't see these kids actually being able to be successful in learning the content, because I don't think special education teachers can do it all.
So teacher quality is immensely important, and I think chipping away at the observations as well as the knowledge measures and other ways that maybe we all can think about to measure who is effective is all important. But interested, Mary, in your reactions.
One of the things that has bothered me about the knowledge assessments is I expect knowledge to have a more powerful impact on classroom practice, and then it works through classroom practice to students. And I don't think the grants that have supported this research have allowed us to look at it that way. To me, evidence-based practice and teacher quality, at least from what we can do in a school system, it's the most important thing. Both general ed teachers and special ed teachers have to be effective, but there's really nothing in the system to push either one, quite frankly, but especially to push general ed teachers to become effective in dealing with hard-to-teach students. And that really has to change.
Thank you for your interest in this discussion of the future of learning disabilities. CEC encourages you to share this content with your colleagues and respond to it via YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter. You can also share your thoughts by emailing us at service@cec.sped.org with the subject line LD Podcast. We look forward to exploring this topic further at the CEC 2011 Convention and Expo, April 25th through 28th in National Harbor, Maryland. We hope you will join us there. To register, visit our website at www.cec.sped.org.